Buonasera a tutti, good evening, and welcome to everyone who is here with us in person, but also a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us online via Zoom from all parts of the United States. My name is Emanuele Amendola. I'm the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Los Angeles. Benvenuti. I'm very happy to open this evening's book presentation with award-winning author and translator Claudia Durastanti, in conversation with Professor Clorinda Donato, director of the Clorinda Donato Center for Global Romance Languages and Translation Studies at the California State University, Long Beach. This event is presented as part of our programs for Women's History Month, celebrating and supporting the role of women in our society. As you are all aware, these days we are witnessing something that we would have never wanted to witness: another war. War is never the answer, and this is just another reminder that we should never take peace for granted. You will see, those of you who are here with us tonight in person, when leaving the building, that the facade of the Italian Cultural Institute is going to be lit with the colors of the Ukrainian flag in a sign of solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And with this in mind, I also would like to remember in particular tonight the women of Ukraine. We have witnessed ourselves how fundamental the role of women is for society in moments of crisis and difficulties. And I'm sure that the women of Ukraine will be fundamental in rebuilding Ukraine's future once all of this will be over, and we hope it's going to be soon. Claudia Durastanti has spent many years interrogating the limits of language, first out of necessity and later by choice. Born in the United States to Italian parents, both deaf, who never taught her sign language, she grew up between Brooklyn and Basilicata in southern Italy. The frustration, silences, and miscommunications that marked her childhood can be felt in her work as a translator as well as in her work as an author. La Straniera, her fourth novel, was a finalist for the Premio Strega in 2019, and its translation in English by Elizabeth Harris, Strangers I Know, received a PEN Award. Tonight's conversation with Claudia will be conducted, as I mentioned, by Clorinda Donato, who directs the Clorinda Donato Center for Global Romance, Languages and Communication and Translation Studies at the California State University, Long Beach, which is also professor of French and Italian. She teaches courses in literary translation with an emphasis on translation in the 18th century and translating gender. I would like to remember, amongst her many publications, the life and legend of Caterina Vizzani, Sexual Identity, Science and Sensationalism in 18th Century Italy and England, published by Oxford University Studies in the Enlightenment. After the conversation, we will have a Q&A session with Claudia, moderated by Francesco Chianese, who is Marie Curie Fellow at Cardiff University and California State University, Long Beach. If you are joining this event online, feel free to ask your questions using the Q&A function of your Zoom client at any point during the presentation, and we'll be trying to answer to as many questions as possible later on. I also would like to say, for those of you who are following us online, that this program is an American Sign Language accessible event, and I would like to thank our interpreters who are joining us remotely. So now I'm very pleased to welcome on stage Clorinda Donato and Claudia Durastanti.
Thank you very much, Emanuele. Well, one of the best things about being on stage is that I got to take my mask off. So anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here this evening. And we want to spend all of our time talking to Claudia, of course. But I want to remind you of what a milestone it is, especially if we think about women writers. This is the month of women. And if you can imagine that, of women, and of course, a situation of a transnational Italian-American, Italian woman, when I did my graduate work in literary studies, Italian, French, Spanish, can you imagine that I never read one woman writer? Not one. I was never assigned a reading of any Italian-American writer either. So I think this tells you how far we've come, but how much more there is to do. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here today with a woman writer who really does encompass so many of the things that in our culture today are pressing, but in particular for those of us who identify with and love Italian and Italian-American culture. So let me start with that. Strangers I Know, which is the American or English translation of her novel, well, classified as a novel, we'll talk about that. La Straniera is a transnational and transgenerational narrative that really speaks to Italians and Italian Americans. Claudia, can you tell us how both have informed your book?
Hi, everyone. I don't know, is it working? No. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the introduction. And I'll get back to the point that even as an Italian educated person, when I was in high school, I rarely read Italian women. So I went back to masters of Italian fiction, like Natalia Ginsburg, for example, in translation. So it was a long journey, but it's interesting that our approach to literature became, for me, that kind of English-Italian perspective informs the way I read now, helping me discover and go back to Italian women writers through translation in English. Speaking about my coming of age as a reader and writer, I didn't really acknowledge the influence that this kind of experience in a family signed by deafness and migration and this very specific Italian-American community and Brooklyn and Basilicata was underneath my writing. It has been for a very long time, and this kind of exploded when I acknowledged that openly in this book. And the only expression I could use that made sense to me is the fact that I was raised into this black market of language context. Often when we speak about languages and influences in tradition and translation, we come from this idea that there's an organic whole of a language and then you switch to another code. But we move from the assumption that there's a shared meaning and there's a coherence, let's say, into the world you're switching. And what I found as a little girl is that there was no coherence. And specifically, all the expectations I had around language were not satisfied by my family. I was a very moralistic child. I thought that to adapt, to adjust in a society, to have a happy life in a society, you need to learn language. So why do women in my family, my grandmother, who didn't handle Italian in the first place, she spoke dialect and she never really landed into the English language. And so she was kind of a failed astronaut in a way, that she was floating in space and she was neither there or here. And that was a very strong influence. And then my mother's experience through language, nobody could understand why this woman who had a girl in the States moved to join her family in Brooklyn, age 34. She takes the kids and moves into this very small town in southern Italy. And so I was trying to decode this as a mystery. Who moves, you know, from the future back to to the past. And then I realized that, and she told me that she moved back into her mother tongue. And so I thought that was interesting in the sense that this book is about the language, the family lexicon I share with my mother, moving from the assumption that a mother is a language, but also language is a mother, and what happens when you feel that you are an orphan with every language that was spoken to and that you learned. So it was floating around these ideas, and this had consequences on the structure of the book, which is non-linear and doesn't move from the idea that we are translating from worlds that are coherent or very linear in their presentation.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, I wanted to ask you about the title of your book. Who is La Straniera? Of course, when you read the book and you're reading the first chapter, you're immediately confronted with the fact that Claudia's parents are deaf. And the title of her book is La Straniera. The title in English is Strangers I Know. But I want to know, who is La Straniera? Is it you? Is it your mother? And what is the genre of your book? I hadn't noticed until after I was writing these questions that on the cover of your book it says novel. But is it an autobiography or a biography? Anyway, I'm sure there's a lot to say there, so I'll let you take that.
Yes, so the book opens with this sort of poetic statement about two young, deaf, almost teenagers, people meet in Rome. So the account of the woman, my mother, is that she met this man who was trying to jump off a bridge. And then she realized, and it sounded very implausible. It sounded almost too much like a novel, that she would save this guy and he would be deaf too. They spend the night together, and I was raised with this sort of mythology about their encounter. And then when I started to think about writing my own family lexicon, my father told me a different account of how they met. He said, I saved her from an aggression in the same area in Rome, which is Trastevere. And so I felt relieved in a way that I could get rid of my mother's myth. It's very hard to defy the mythology of a mother. And all of a sudden I had a novel because I had two contradicting versions. And it was also interesting to me to meditate on the expectations we have when we write about the margins or marginalities. Here you had a woman, a character in this book, which happens to be my mother, who was deaf, but was not following the traditional code or understanding of how you deal with disability, which often in literature, especially in Italian literature, I must say, I think it has to do with some retro Catholicism. In a way, there's this very strong imprint of being a good deaf person, a good poor person, or good in your marginalities, and trying to convey a sense of difference that is not too menacing. My parents were the opposite. They didn't use sign language. They were living disability with recklessness. And also they had a very twisted relationship with fiction in a way. My mother and my father love autobiographies, love biopics, and they have a hard time in thinking that novels really exist. And so this was confusing for me as a person, but it was very illuminating as a writer in a sense. I would go to the cinema or the movies with my father, and he would pick up movies that maybe were not very adapted to my age, and like Scarface, Clockwork Orange. I saw those when I was not even 10, and he would start to act like them, like the alienated, mostly male figures of cinema, especially American cinema in the 70s. And so that was confusing because I felt that every time we crossed the threshold and we were out of a cinema, everything got very blurry. And so this was a strong influence on why I decided to use it as a frame, this indistinction, this disorder between fiction and nonfiction, which is also to make a joke out of these marketable categories in a way. I wanted a book that booksellers would say, oh, where does this go through? And so it's funny because the English publisher Fitzcarraldo has a blue series for fiction, a white series for nonfiction. It's very standard. And so they were like, what do you want to do with this? And I said, why don't we do it in pale blue. I wanted, the book to be the first Fitzcarraldo pale blue book, and that made sense. And when I was speaking about expectations, if I went to a publisher and said, oh, this is the story of these two deaf teenagers that meet this way, the story of a father, my mother's father, that has a deaf teenage daughter, and her family, everybody bought her devices to hear music. So my mother would have headphones in the house when I was a little girl, and friends would come over and they would say, your mother is deaf, what is she doing? And why everybody is in a sort of denial. And I thought it was very ambiguous and playful, but I thought a publisher would say, this is too much. No, it's implausible because you have expectations of what works in fiction. And I really wanted to write a book in which not things do make sense in a life as much as they could make sense, but I didn't want it to work as, fictions or autobiographies or memoirs especially. I was trying to think, and then I'll wrap it up, why I was so bothered by, people would ask, what you're working on? Oh, the language my parents spoke, migration from my grandparents in the United States, my life coming of age, and then me moving to London. Oh, you're writing a memoir. And I got so offended because I thought, no, I'm working on a literary book, because memoir felt something, especially as a woman, that would lower the threshold. And my mother made it very clear to me. I read her diaries all over life. She kept them since she was a very young girl. And it felt that autobiography was the genre of survivors, that you necessarily had to have a trauma, an exile, illness. And why, if it's a woman writing it, is usually a memoir or autobiography, and if it comes from a male consciousness, it's more inclined to be autofiction. So that was also something that I was thinking about.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Also, the gendering of genre. I mean, this is a fascinating topic. I actually hope you'll write about that, because that's helped me a lot understand your book. And I really hope you will read her book, because you will find many things in it as Italians and as Italian Americans that will resonate with you. I certainly did. I wanted then to talk about, one of the things that resonated with me was the way you talked about the South. Of course, my family is from the South, and I really was struck by, the South as a metaphor in your book, and that begs the question, what happened to the North? What is going on right now? The South is really having a moment, and what is that moment about, and how, again, did that inform your book?
Yes, so I recently discovered, which I should have known probably since high school, that South is a word that comes from Northern languages, from the Dutch, from the English, like it's Sooth. And I never really thought about it, that it's from a far perspective. I'm writing a little bit about it right now, and so even in Strangers I Know, my first novels were all set in the United States. I had a very hard time with reconnecting with what the South was, because it is a container of mythologies and often stereotypes in a way. I was raised in this region called Basilicata. I don't know if you're aware of it, but I recently found out they usually call it the Texas of Italy, because there's oil extraction. So it feels that you're not even able to afford your own specificity, and you have to externalize it to another cultural landscape. And then, funnily enough, I learned that it was called, back in the day, the island of Italy, because you have more people from Basilicata abroad than you actually have them there. So what stands in between this fake Irishness and this fake Texanhood? And it's an interesting region, because it's located within strong attractors, which is, Calabria here, Sicily, and Campania, and they had often a more recursive and abundant body of work in terms of novels. So when I was writing Strangers I Know, I was also free not to have a sort of legacy. It's very hard to write about place when you have authors that kind of crystallized or invented place. So in Rome, for me, it was very hard to write about the outskirts of Rome without the example of Pasolini. With Basilicata and that kind of South I was raised in, I was lucky because not a lot of people wrote about it, and the only book you needed to read, which was translated and also in the US back in the day, it was a big success. It was Christ Stopped in Eboli by Carlo Levi. And that book bothered me. I read it, I don't know if you're aware or familiar with it, but it's set in this kind of badlands, in this very specific landscape that I was raised like 15 minutes from this place that was portrayed in Levi's book. And I could see that very specific landscape, for example, in Terrence Malick's films. I would see it. Recently, it was in Nomaland, that kind of scenario, and I would respond to that again when it was externalized, but I wouldn't recognize it as my own. When it was presented as the Italian South. So again, I don't know if we're speaking about translation, but sometimes to reclaim something, I felt I had to go out and then come back in. I think music is an interesting filter to understand what's happening in the south of Italy. Of course, you had the very paradigmatic example of Naples, where you had a sort of bomb of new fictions. I'm not referring only to Ferrante. If you care about Italian music, years ago, you had another anonymous producer, a musician called Liberato, that was doing this interesting experiment of blending the new melodic style, the one that my grandfather loved, and then with, you know, more urban and contemporary sounds. So there was this idea, again, of being in place and going out of place. And that is something that has happened recently. So it also is problematic in the sense that being such a container, as I said, of mythologies and stereotypes, the South calls for a lot of requests of authenticity, which when you're in the margins, it feels like you almost have to obey. I hate the word authenticity so much because it feels, again, be a good, authentic person in a way. So with Strangers I Know, I was trying to describe a Basilicata that was way more anarchic and modern for me and my mother, for example, compared to Brooklyn, because the Brooklyn I knew back then, it often happens to migrant communities. In Italy, you have this funny place called Italia in Miniatura. I don't know if you're familiar with it. They would take us there to visit when we were in middle school. It's a giant plastic Italy, and you can walk in between Venice and Matera, the Vatican. You step all over the place. And I felt that what my grandparents did in Brooklyn was rebuilt a sort of the South in miniatura, you know, the little South. It was a sort of Disneyland where, you know, you had a little Sicily, you had a little Basilicata, you had a little Calabria. And so it was also preserving, in a way, traits, but even inventing them. So often to me, what was the output of this invention, I couldn't find it when I went to Basilicata. So when I went back to Italy, unlike my grandparents that always said they wanted to move back, I felt that it was out of sync in a way, like bad dubbing. And so they would have expectation of that place being way more traditional and authentic, and they were kind of disappointed when they came back. So I think we were disappointed on both sides. My mother left a very patriarchal Italian-American family to find her own freedom in what was considered to be a very old-style patriarchal community in the little town. But over there, she was free because she had no family, and having no family in Italy, I think, is the first blasphemy in a way.
Thank you. No, it's fascinating what you're saying. I'm reminded of a pizzeria we used to go to, and the map of Italy that they had on the cover of their menu started, it was just from Naples down. And I thought, that's the little South that and we always would laugh about that menu, but I think that was really the area that they wanted to think about. When we think about the South, of course, let's talk about Southern California, which is also having a moment. And you talk about having visited here. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about LA. LA, of course, is probably in terms of the outpost of the Italian American and Italian communities in LA, in the United States. We always think of New York, but I myself, being an Italian American in LA, it was actually liberating because there wasn't that much family around. They were all back on the East Coast or in Chicago. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, just to get back to something you asked me about the north, what happened to the north? What happened to the north of Italy in the past 5 years is that they discovered the south again. And so I would have friends in the music industry that were writing about bands, and they were, oh, I want to write about Neapolitan music. Now I'm going to go there and stay for 3-4 months. And it sounded to me like they were these kind of Victorian anthropologists that felt that they were going through their own heart of darkness in a way. Which was very absurd. Or you would have videos, and there's interesting documentaries on YouTube on Neapolitan contemporary music, and you would have these kind of different multi-level subtitles in a way, so not only for the Northerners. So there's a whole debate on what's the language of the South. Going back to your question, yeah, I was here like 9 years ago. And when you visit a new city, you're rarely innocent in the sense that I had this mythology. Again, to me, write about place and landscape, I think it was always very powerful, even more than family in a way. My early fiction was more about the influence of landscape on place, on how you shape your own voice. So of course, when I came to LA for the first time, I had very seducing expectations on traffic, especially and highways. I first read, my first account of LA in fiction was in Play It As It Lays by late John Didion, unfortunately. And so I had this sort of metaphysical expectation about it. And I was really happy to find out that the one thing I believed about LA, the absence of a center, which can be very disorientating if you're raised in a very codified European structure of a city. It felt to me almost in an oppressive way that in Italian little towns and villages and small cities and bigger cities, there were always a center of gravity. And so to me, it was interesting to see an archipelago city in a way, and I immediately had this idea of an archipelago, and you can say that every island has their own center, but it felt like an octopus, which became very popular then as an animal in the past few years, a very metaphorical animal for the present. But that was my first impression, and it's a silly thing, but these days I was thinking about form. Especially if you're thinking about novels that are influenced about space, spending time on highways, never reaching to the point, being slowed down. Why did this produce mostly minimalist accounts? And I was wondering why nobody ever wrote a Ulysses on the highways, like this very painstaking experience of the shattering of time, because you're never, but this maybe is a romantic interpretation of it, but to me it was funny to realize that there is a lot of minimalist pioneer mythology around this city. And when you think about pioneers, of course you think about migrants, and of course you think about how Italians got here and when. I don't know much about that, and I always wondered if this kind of configuration of the city was more encouraging in disappearing in a way. New York or the East Coast, I felt that often Italian American families were repelled by the center. I remember one of the first definitions that my family said, I was very begging to go to Brooklyn, to Manhattan. My grandma used to work in Midtown, and everybody was bothered by my insisting, can we go? And they thought the city was boring, irrelevant, and naked, and I'm like, you came all the way up here. And so the center, if that makes sense, for them was very menacing, bothersome. And so I wonder if the urbanistic structure of a place like LA or the communities around LA, where I had a different assimilation process because of how it's structured. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, that I would say that's definitely the case, and that's another whole topic. But certainly, I think Italian Americans, who came to LA, it was liberating because they didn't have huge families to report to, in a sense. And of course, I've always thought that one of the greatest things about Los Angeles is the ability to disappear, to be visible when you want to and be invisible when you don't. Those things weren't valued much, 50, 60, 70 years ago, and now they are. So I really think that also as a city of literary inspiration, I think some of the things you were talking about are coming. So maybe you'll be somebody to write about Los Angeles, exactly the kind of book you were talking about. One of the things that struck me the most in your book was the way you talked about your parents and their notion of love, that they almost didn't need it, because being deaf, the two of them, they shared an essence somehow. And I found that so compelling and difficult to understand, probably because, again, I'm trying to relate to it through language. And it made me think also about your decision to study anthropology at the university. And I was wondering about how that might have been influenced by your desire to understand the bond between your parents as a sort of, as a kinship, as something much deeper in essence. I was just wondering if you could talk about that a bit, because it was one of the parts of your book that really struck me.
Yeah, so not only my mother didn't believe in novels, but she had a hard time with the word love, or the expression ti amo, I love you. And she would say, I don't understand what this means. So, and she would say, your father and I had something that was deeper, brought us closer than love. That was intimacy. And at the beginning, I thought, oh, maybe it's because they were both deaf and they had similar strategies of hiding or going undercover or acting like spies with their deafness. And the other word she always had issues with was happiness. And so she would use a substitute that was meaning. And so, strangers, I know it's not a spoiler, but in the end, when I asked my mother about her perception of herself, I asked, how do you feel that your life would have been without deafness? And she was not thinking maybe happier or unhappier. She would have said it would have been meaningless in a way. So the quest over there was for meaning rather than feeling. And so trying to convey this, it was also a meditation on how, for my parents, sometimes in the deaf community, there is a relationship with literal language, with metaphors, or with symbolism or allegories, all things that I wanted to learn to handle, because my interest was in fiction. And then I realized that instead, in their literal approach to life, an approach that was often prone to mistakes or ambiguities, it was liberating in a way. As a child of migration, when I moved back to Italy, I was obsessed with standard Italian. So I would learn it perfectly. I would try to speak it well. I didn't even allow myself to fully learn dialect or to speak it. It was, prohibited. I had an older brother that thought that dialect would even oppress us more in terms of class or perception, because we already had too many marginalities in our life. And so I think that my approach to language was a little boring. So this book was also an exploration of error in a way, or what happens when we allow ourselves to slip and to work on the consequences of a linguistic mistake, which is something very sensitive, because we were speaking about before in the backstage of, if somebody criticizes my fiction, I say, okay, you like it, you don't like it. If somebody criticizes a translation that I've put out there, I work as a translator, I feel I can cry, I get very sensitive. And that reminds me of when you move from one country to the other, you try to learn another language and then something slips and you use a word that you're not supposed to use, you all feel ashamed, you know? So language is a vehicle for way too many feelings. And I think that with my mother, I learned how to put feeling and love a little bit out of it and to work more on meaning. So this is why I wanted to use that image, which is very strong. I don't know what ti amo means, so we don't say it. And also, again, how fiction influences us and helps us understand something that we're given for granted. So I was raised with a deaf mother. Deafness should have been a big topic in my life, but it became very opaque at one point, because if you constantly deal with it, it kind of disappears. And I went back through it when I saw this film, Arrival by Daniel Villeneuve, what is based on a short story by Ted Chiang. Aliens arrive on Earth, and that was something very common when I was growing up. We had tons of films like Independence Day, you know, the aliens were always evil. The aliens always had plans. And when I was growing up, my brother would say, our parents are not really deaf. They're aliens pretending to be deaf because they want to take over the world, and if they pretend to be deaf, everybody would assume they're good people. And so that's, you know, kind of a going undercover. And I hadn't thought it about a long time, but when I see the film based on this short story, the main character is a linguist, and they hire her, you know, the government program, because the aliens are arriving. And how do you decode what they really want if you don't share a language? And so it was surprising that this happened so much. We've been thinking and writing about aliens and sci-fi for such a long time, and rarely, at least in terms of my knowledge, there was this focus on a shared language. And so that was, I think, when I used anthropology, coming from very far away, to think about my family as a visitor. This is my family, it's a community, and I walked out of it. And then what if I approach it in terms of visiting a foreign community? I thought that was interesting, because also it kind of avoided my eye to be, I wouldn't say involved, of course it was involved, but not being the center of the narration process.
That's really interesting, because it reminds me in a way of, you know, the way in which sort of the intellectual pursuit allows you to place your parents and your family in a historical or an intellectual context, and allows you to get closer to them, possibly without as much emotion. Is that what you mean also, or?
Yeah, lately I've been thinking about something that was not very explicit to me while I was growing up. The fact that I always, often, in this little town, I didn't have access to many books. I had to read the books that my mother had, and often there were counterculture books, books about the margins, and so you had outsiders. Outsider, interesting enough, is the English title for Albert Camus' Lo Straniero, which The Stranger, which was an open influence for this book. And so I would read about the margins, but I couldn't find my parents in those books. So I wrote Strangers I Know because I missed my father and mother, but I didn't miss them in my life. I missed them in novels, because all the portraits I found of characters like them, or deaf characters, as again, were kind of complying with certain expectations. And so I wanted a little bit to focus on this kind of different representation and write a sort of intersectional book, if that makes any sense, in which I would think about my consciousness as a woman raised in the South, not even in a working class family. You have tons of literature on working class family, but what do you have when, you know, lumpen was very underneath, because my mother was, as a deaf woman, living on the welfare system. And so I wanted to use all of these pieces and see how they would interact or sabotage each other and then explode. And then when the explosion happened, I had shatters, and I could write about those shatters, and it's the book that came out.
Thank you. I really find the your use of the term intersectional, incredibly helpful in thinking about your book. And I'm sorry that we've come to the end of our discussion with Claudia, but happy that it's time now for you as the audience, both the audience here and the online audience, to ask your questions. And I will turn over the microphone to Francesco Chianese for this part of the hour.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Claudia. Just very quickly, I would like to share with you what a pleasure it's for me to be here again with Clorinda and with Claudia. We were here 3 years ago, and we were talking about the Italian diaspora again with a group of scholars from all around Italy and the US. And so many things changed in those last 3 years. And so I find really amazing that we are able to do this again with Claudia in this case. And so I really want to thank the Institute for organizing this, and Clorinda and Claudia for believing in it, believing it was possible to have it. And so I would like to open the question time. Do you have any question for Claudia in the room? Because I've been waiting for a question from online, but okay, I have one. Any questions from the in-person? Okay, can you speak in the microphone, please?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm curious to know whether you wrote originally in Italian or you wrote in English, and if you did not write the Italian, who was your translator?
Yeah, so I wrote the book in Italian except for one part that is on subtitles, sign language, and Sanremo, which is an Italian music festival that my mother would watch. I usually write short pieces of nonfiction in English, and then my fiction is mostly in Italian. What was funny is that I put this chapter in English that I wrote in English, I translated myself, and it came out in Italy. Then the book was translated into English by Elizabeth Harris, and she said, "You already wrote this in English. What should we do? Should we keep it as a separate part in the book? Where is your English voice coming into?" But that would have been uneven. And so she translated this essay that is in the book on sign language into English, and not surprisingly, it's very different from my original English text. I don't know if it flows better, if it does not, it's just different. So I was immensely lucky to have a translator that had a conversation with me, but I wanted her to turn this book into something her own, in a way that was filtered by her experience of being an American who studied Italian, that was raised in a different family context. I thought that the book, The Strangers I Know, who had several translations, could benefit by this approach of me not being too, not involved, but not being politicizing too much the translation, which I could have done in English. And another funny thing to say about this translation, and speaking about Italian, in Italian, the words in dialect we're putting in italics, which is often something that you do when there is a foreign word. When Elizabeth Harris delivered the manuscript to the publisher, they wanted to put a lot of words in italics, Italian words, and because they said, oh, the audience might not understand, we need to emphasize the fact that this is foreign. And she said, no, the only words in italics in the book are English words, and sometimes there are words that come, you know, from back in the day, or there's a reason. But I thought it was very playful to use this strangeness into the in the English language, and kind of making it more transparent, the Italian contribution to it. And so when we use, there's a whole debate around what do we put in italics in language, what is foreign and what is not. And I thought it was exciting to see something in italics that was English, in an English text.
Any other questions from the room? We also have a few ones in, actually a few interesting ones actually.
Yeah, so I don't really have a question. It's more just a reflection on your book. I was born in a town very close where you are.
Where?
I'm from Brienza.
Yeah.
So I know all your area really well, and I'm older than you, so when you were born, I was already in high school. But it's kind of interesting, like, and I had a parallel story to a friend of mine that he was from Brooklyn, that he moved back in Italy, and I met him at high school. And what I found interesting is that for us in high school, he was God. He was from Brooklyn. And instead, in your story, you are an alien there. So I don't know how he really felt when he was there, but I feel like, wow, this is interesting. So he was God for us, and he was not an alien to us. But you look in the book, or your protagonist, if you want to say like that, completely isolated, completely out of place. And I'm wondering if that was because the handicap that your parents had, or that is the first things that I have really my question for you. And at the same time, when you talk about Basilicata, it's kind of strange because you bring up, and it's a little bit different. My town, and this is a classic, right? I'm better than you in my little town than yours. But I mean, yours is very small, you know, right there because Villa d'Agri is the big center. So, but at the same time, I found like, wow, this is kind of interesting, like, because these people in this little village, they look really behind from the past, which I think where really the past is today and before is Brooklyn. Brooklyn, they still live like when they left 50 years ago. The past is there. Now it's the area, my friend is from Williamsburg, is highly gentrified, right? So, but really they are in the past there today, rather than Basilicata, which is in the future. So, thank you.
Yeah, I will be very brief. When I was writing this book, I was with this American writer friend. He was visiting me in London, and he was, can you tell me a little bit about your childhood? And I said, oh, we landed there. So I was using also a spaceship metaphor in a way, in the way I was describing our arrival again in Basilicata. And so when I was telling him this story, I was like, oh, it sounds like a little bit of a sci-fi Western in a way. You had the fixed characters. You had the priest, you had the doctor, and then you had the heretical person. So I think my mother was a carrier of strangeness in this very compact community. Nothing made sense. She was the first divorced woman of the town. She was deaf. She was a painter. She would hang out with younger men, which also was kind of a taboo. So I think, again, using the bomb image, it was everything compressed. And so, and I'm not saying that we were the modernizers. It wouldn't be fair. But at the same time, coming from the United States, of course, we had a relationship with mass production artifacts, let's say. So we would, deal with poverty, but we had Nikes. We were outsiders, but I had Barbies. And it was interesting to see how we would use this to seduce the community in a way. So it feels a little bit disturbing on how that kind of naive capitalism that you would have in following trends and stuff like that could be a weapon in a way to become accustomed there. So if I had to think about what was seducing God and not make us feel aliens, it was products or stuff that came from America. I remember that each summer I would visit my family in Brooklyn and come back with something new, a new book, a new record, and use that in a way. But it makes you think about what's the pleasable aspect of foreignness and what is not the unpleasant aspect of it. So that, to me, the dichotomy was very clear. And I agree with the fact that it was weird for me. Go back to Brooklyn, I was into indie alternative music. I would ask my cousins to bring me to the Lower East Side and buy the Velvet Underground. And they were like, "You're Italian, why don't you listen to Italian music?" And they would love it, and I would not. And so I think I was fighting most of my teenage years to show that I was also American, and those who stayed in Brooklyn were fighting for the opposite thing. And so we had conversations about, we were, as I said, me and my cousins and me and my family, all of us were in between, really. So I never landed fully into an American experience, and they never landed fully into Italian experience. And I think we were on the opposite sides, but we were in this in-betweenness where the sense of time changes profoundly. So it was easy to think that Basilicata was the past or archaic place, and Brooklyn was the future. In my experience, it was not at all like that.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. I will pick up a couple of questions from the audience on Zoom now. This is the big one. What inspired you to be a translator?
What is? Sorry?
What inspired you to be a translator?
Okay, again, not only film conversations, there's somebody would ask you something at one point in your life, and it would make you rethink or revise stuff. I was with an American poet years ago, and she would ask me, "Why did you become a translator?" And I never really thought about it. And the most spontaneous thing I could say was, "Oh, I've done this all my life." And so I thought that me being an interpreter, even if I didn't, use sign language, that was very frequent. And when you speak with children of migration, in a way that they're, and that was true for me also as a daughter of a deaf woman, that you become an interpreter immediately, and you are in between words, and especially you become accustomed with the language that is sometimes specific, let's say, well, bureaucratic. You have to deal with healthcare systems, you have to deal with power systems where there's teachers and stuff like that. And so you have to, I wouldn't say become a spy, but you have to master, even at a young age, and different lexicons and different vocabularies. And that proved to be very resourceful when I started working on novels. I had a good training, let's say.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask you this other one that is a bit long. It is very interesting the way you relate to linguistics and literature. I understand you have a background in anthropology. Did you study linguistics formally? Or if you did not, is it that you have an innate understanding of linguistics because of your parents' deafness? This is from Wendy Horowitz from LA Library.
Yes, so when I enrolled in cultural anthropology, one of the first things that you're taught, they kind of push you to think deeply about why do you choose some words, why do you don't use other words, which words are accessible to who in terms of your position in life. So I think that was very important to me, not only in my practice as a translator, but this position of who speaks in what way, where, and to who, kind of, very basic and raw and rudimental skills of linguistic studies, which I don't have. But it was kind of a very light imprint that would then make me think about language in this book. And I was very preoccupied on who's allowed to say what. So I think that rather than focusing on the mechanics, let's say, of linguistics, I was very interested in the power terms of language. And I think that was one of the other threads that I wanted to address in Strangers I Know.
That's great. Any other question from the room? I'm trying to be kind of inclusive of both audiences.
Okay, hi, thanks for being here. This has been so interesting. I just wanted to ask you, kind of going back to the genre crossing of the novel, and especially what you were talking about, how a lot of the events in the book feel very unrealistic or magical. And I wondered if there was any relation to the novel being set in southern Italy, and southern Italy being kind of this magical place, or this place that's very connected to magical practices, and if the genre crossing was sort of a way to rethink that magic in a book form. I don't know, I just would like to hear what you have to think about that.
No, that's very interesting. So the region I was raised in, Basilicata, was discovered, explored by Ernesto De Martino and tons of ethnomusicologists and ethnopsychiatrists, and there was this strong focus on the shattering of the self, crisi della presenza in the South, and magic as a tool and a resource. And so to me, it was fascinating because those accounts and tales were set mostly in between the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We got there in the 90s. What kind of value magic had for my mother settling there? And was there a connection of this underground world or upper world where things were not visible, but they were sensed? And I had a very strong opposition to that. As a paradox, I would read novels, but I thought that was a strong, realistic approach to life, whereas the magic that my mother was abusing in a way and reading tarots and practicing it, to me felt very distant from the art of fiction. And so this book was also a tool to explore the connection of that and the influence. I speak about the demonic influx of my mother and my father with their, I think they were, most of the characters in this book, most of the portraits of people in my family, they were not maybe strong readers, but they were embodying literature and they were acting as walking novels in a way. They had an aspiration, maybe not openly expressed, that didn't have to do with, this kind of, maybe it was also narcissistic in a way, and maybe they never thought that a niece or a daughter would write about them. But in a way, I think to me it was very interesting to explore what was magic, fiction, was reality, what was the blend in between the two. And it's interesting that writing about Basilicata right now across time, I would find traces of when you're like reading coffee beans, and you had these old women in Basilicata that would read the future and the remnants of industrial outputs in the 50s. So you had factories there, you had residues of, let's say, iron and stuff like that, and they would use something so contemporary to practice something else. And so I think that was what I was trying to do in kind of discovering the leftovers of magic, if that makes any sense, and trying also to be honest about the fact that as much as I wanted to use literature as realism, then that didn't hold up in a way. So this was, for me, also a tribute to I will be brief, but if we speak about the South, in the midst of the South, De Martino used to speak about la crisi della presenza, the crisis of the self. You have Elena Ferrante talking about la smarginatura, which is, the self that kind of shatters in the margins and not really feeling into your body. You had Paolo Sorrentino, I know you didn't see it, the last film, he uses an expression, his teacher, Antonio Capuano, was inspiration in cinema, non ti disunire, which is a very goofy way to say don't, fall apart. And so I was already thinking about the PhD thesis, and a lot of theses coming out about the crisis of the self in the Mediterranean, Southern Italian experience, preferably through a female perspective. And so my mother knows nothing about theory, but I think she would be a good example of what these writers and artists are working on.
I've been taking note from this last question. It's marvelous to listen to Claudia talking. I can go on for hours, and she knows it. So, but we have to wrap it up. And if you allow me to ask just a last question to Claudia, because La Straniera was out in 2019, and I wanted to ask her what kind of feelings gives to you to keep talking and presenting this book after 3 years, given that it's a book that involves you so deeply emotionally, and from Italian to English, which is the language of, I would say, the other half of your identity. I don't know if you agree on this definition, but I mean, we were discussing this book together in an interview in exactly when the book was out. It was like February 2019. So now we are 3 years later in LA, and you are presenting this really important book to the American public, so to the American audience. How do you feel? How would you, I don't know, describe this moment that you are having your first book tour in the US?
Yeah, so it's a unique case. I think this didn't happen for my fiction before. It's not going to happen for my next work in terms of fiction, because this was meant and thought about as a shape-shifting book. One example is the fact that I wanted the order not to be the same, and then my publisher thought this is a very challenging and complex idea, and I think she meant that it was too pricey to have different editions with a different order of the chapters. And what was very interesting to me is that readers would do it by themselves without me saying, oh, try to read this book not starting from family, starting from love and health, and see if it changes the experience of reading. So I think the reason why it's still interesting for me to meet people who read the book and have questions about the book is that new things come up all of the time, and which is, I'm very lucky, and it is a property of the book, but it is also the fact that even though it's a story of a self, of an I meant it to be very porous and, able to have cracks at which the reading experience can come in. And I think the interaction between these cracks that I've left and how each person reads it differently bring different conversations all the time. So thanks, Clorinda, but no event. When you have a novel, things happen. This is, and time, it's sort of crystallized in time. In these 3 years, perception on certain subjects have changed. The attention around translation, for example, is changing. The attention in disability studies is changing. So I was writing from a perspective that already now feels a little dated. And I also love the fact that in each translation, when I went to meet readers in different countries, I was curious about what would happen in the States. They would have interested in completely different things. So in Germany, it was very political. They were reading the book a lot through disability and class. In Spanish-speaking countries, it was mostly devoted to migration, and so the experience of my family, and then, of course, you see the cultural intimacy between, communities that have migrated, and French translation, the focus was a lot on the experience of autofiction, and so the feminine self. And to me, it was like, time traveling in a way, in a very compressed window of time into different literary traditions and sociological readings of the book. So I think, in a way, rather than saying that I'm touring with this book and I'm absorbing, and so what I absorb in all of these events changes the way I think about this book. So this is the first time I'm speaking about it here in the country of, I started the event talking about the black market language. I think about English as my blueprint language, so it was even more original than a mother tongue, it's kind of the absolute that you cannot stand up to, which is why I don't write in English, perhaps. I think it always has to be a destination I never reach, and that tension in between me not reclaiming English fully for myself is a desire you can sense in my Italian. And I think it's interesting when we don't fully land into one language and we are in that space.
And this is amazing because actually Claudia just answered the question that we didn't had time to go through, why she didn't translate the book. So everything connects eventually. So thank you, Claudia, for this generous conversation with us. Thank you for coming. I don't know if I have to just wrap up and close. So yes, thank you everybody for coming and for this beautiful event.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Thanks, Clorinda, Francesco, Emanuele.